Welcome back to Outward Home Learning. The subject is computer science, and today you're looking at the internet. So this is a really large topic. For this, you need to take notes whilst Mr. Holton is telling you all about it so that you don't forget anything for the questions that you'll be looking at a bit later on. So without any further ado, over to Mr. Holton.
The internet then, kind of useful, isn't it? We're going to go over the internet and some of the technologies which are on it which make it so useful. But let's just start off straight off with a definition. So what is the internet? Well, it's a global network of networks. So we have the idea of a network, and if we connect them together and they go across the whole planet, then it becomes the internet. All right, so that is what the internet is a global network of networks. And some of the most useful things you will find on the internet are provided by servers, which is something that we're going to talk about now. What a server is and how it is used. So a server provides a service to a client, and it's one of those things which is probably best given as an example so it's sort of better understood. And the example we'll go through is with a web server. So if you imagine you sat in front of your computer on the web browser, you are a client, and you will type in a web address at the top of your browser, and then your browser will go to a web server somewhere and request the service, which in this case is delivering a web page. So see how that works? You have a web server and you have yourself there as a client getting the web page. So here's our server, here's our web page, here's you getting that web page, and here it is. You request the web page from the server, and then in its response, it gets returned to you as a client. Okay, and then everything else we're going to talk about really revolves around this and what servers are and how they're used, because we're going to talk about hosting. So if you wanted to set up a web server somewhere, you've got a couple of options in front of you. You've got the idea of doing hosting, and you've got the idea of using some sort of cloud services, which is what we're going to cover now. So hosting is where you get someone to run the server for you, because you've got quite a lot of cost in the setup of this. You've got the idea that you'll have to buy a very powerful computer called a server. You'd have to do all the network hardware for that server. It is not cheap, and it requires quite a bit of technical expertise. So you'd probably end up having to pay somebody to manage that server. So like here, for example, this server here, if you're hosting, will be stored by hosting.inc, which is let's say that's a company, and then quite often you will pay them a monthly fee. But that would be, importantly, cheaper than having to host the whole thing yourself and pay somebody to maintain it for you. But you, as the owner of that server, usually have quite a bit of control over the actual machine itself. So that means like you can set up and sort out your own security around it, and you don't necessarily run into too many problems with the Data Protection Act if you host that server within your country and you protect it thoroughly. Okay, so that's hosting. So then what is the cloud? Because that is sort of like hosting, but just subtly different, and it does actually give us a lot more benefits. So let's talk about this. What's the cloud? Well, basically, it's when you do this. It's when you don't care about the server whatsoever. So you don't care about that physical box, and you just want the service. You just want, for example, somewhere to store your files or somebody to run a web page for you. You don't care about the actual physical hardware doing it. You just focus on the service itself. And we can use the cloud for all sorts, but one of the most common ones that we use it for is for file storage. So this is something like Google Drive, for example. The idea that we are storing our files somewhere on a server somewhere on the internet, but we don't care about which server. We just want them to be available to us all the time. And this comes with a heck of a lot of advantages as using the cloud. First off, it's probably the cheapest option that's available to you. Quite often, it is cheap than obviously storing any file server yourself, but it's also often given away for free. Also, the services which are provided to you can be easily extended. So, for example, for file storage, more space can be given to you easily, more actual hard drive space. And often these days, they all come with sort of collaborative features. So you've got the idea for like Google Drive, for example, you can easily share files between groups and between people. But you've also got sort of like online word processors and online spreadsheets, which let you work collaboratively as well. When you're dealing with cloud computing, it just provides that service. And it's worth saying, using the cloud, you end up with the advantages of hosting as well. So you don't have to worry about paying someone to run that server for you or anything like that. But it's not all peaches and cream. It's not all positives. There are some real negatives here to sort of focus on in the cloud. The first off is because you are giving up control of any sort of computer whatsoever. You don't know where that information is going to be stored. So you can often run into issues with the Data Protection Act, for example. Is that data being stored outside the country without your knowledge? Are you unknowingly breaking it? And you are relying on somebody else to have all the correct security procedures in place for you. And that to some is very risky. And lastly, and this is probably the biggest one, you need the internet connection. You need an internet connection for all this to work. So if your internet goes down in the office and you've got everything on cloud servers somewhere, then all of a sudden everything grinds to a halt. And that is a huge issue sometimes. So there you go. Hopefully we've sort of detangled a little bit what the cloud does. Hopefully we've got an idea of hosting, and we understand now that the internet really runs on these things called servers, which provide us with loads of services as clients. So imagine for a moment you are in class and you're given a homework, and without a pen and paper your teacher tells you this: I want you to go to 212.58.237.54 and write about what you see there. You would struggle to remember that. Humans are no good at remembering numbers. Humans are much better and much more likely to remember words. And this is really important. This is why we have this system called DNS, the domain name system, to convert from URLs, which you will be familiar with like this. So if I told you instead of that number, if I said go to www.bbc.co.uk, you are more likely to remember that. And the whole idea of DNS is that it goes from a URL, it takes a URL like this one here, www.bbc.co.uk, and it converts it into an IP address. That is how the whole system is supposed to work. So it will take this and it'll convert it into a number, 212.58.237.54 in this case, and that is what the computer needs, importantly, to be able to access the website. Not this, it can't work with words, it needs this, it needs the IP address here, okay? And we are going to talk about basically how that whole system works. So I want you to imagine being at home and then you're on your web browser here. So you're on your computer and this is your web browser. And in that web browser, you type in, let's say we've got Chrome at the open at the top. So we'll put that little symbol there. You type into the bar right at the top, www.bbc.co.uk. So what will happen next is the browser, and it is the browser's job here, so that's the application that triggers this whole thing, will take the URL, so bbc.co.uk, and go and contact the nearest DNS server. Now, more likely than not, that is going to be your internet service provider's DNS server. So let's have this here, DNS server. So that could be, for example, if you're at home, you're probably talking about BT or Virgin or TalkTalk or GiffGaff or something like that. Okay, that would be your DNS server here. And the DNS server will have a big stonking long list of URLs. So for example here, it will already have almost certainly the URL for bbc.co.uk, and it will know from previous requests what the IP address is. So what it does, it takes that URL, matches it up to our IP address, and sends the IP address back to the browser. Okay, then the browser uses that IP address to actually access the website. So it's the IP address which is used, not the URL to access the website. It'll then do this other request, go into the BBC servers, and then your website, your web page will get returned and displayed to you. Okay, so far so good. So that is your typical sort of request and response process for DNS. But things get a little bit thornier if this doesn't happen, if you don't have the website in the DNS server already, because there's a few things that needs to happen then. So let's say the website you're going to visit this time is www.amazon.co.uk, and that .uk is going to be really important going forward, and you'll see why. It's very unlikely this will happen in reality. Chances are the DNS server will have this URL, but let's assume just for a moment that for some reason it doesn't. So it goes to where the IP address for Amazon should be, and it can't find it. So what does it do? I mean, it could just immediately return that we can't find the website, but that's not true. We know this website exists. So the DNS server will then go and contact other DNS servers, and these will be these things called higher authority DNS servers. So if you imagine there's one massive DNS server which deals with all the websites that end with .co.uk, okay? And it will retrieve the IP address from that that DNS server, that higher authority DNS server. And once it's got a copy of that, so it's asked.co.uk, do you have this IP address? And it said, yes, we do have the IP address. Then it takes a copy of it. And that's really important that it takes a copy of that IP address, because it means it doesn't need to ask the .co.uk DNS server again, which means this whole solution can scale properly to work with, the millions of people that use the internet. All right. So now the the DNS server knows the IP address and it can send it back to the browser here, and the browser then accesses the Amazon web page. Okay, so that's how that whole system works. Last wrinkle that could happen: what if we mistype this? And let's say we, instead of looking for amazon.co.uk, we end up typing amanon.co.uk. I don't know, that might actually exist, but let's just say that it doesn't. So amanon.co.uk. So you fudge typing it, we can't find it in the DNS server, and it can't be found in the .co.uk server. Well, in that case, you get an error message returned. It says, nope, we can't find this website anywhere. It doesn't exist. So that's how DNS works, all about moving from words to numbers, which, is easier for humans to use.
Okay, so now it's time for your first activity. The first activity is going to be a task where you need to fill in the blanks. You'll be given all of the different words to fill those blanks in with, and then we will review those afterwards. So you've got about 10 minutes to complete that activity. Then we'll go over to Mr. Barnes to review the answers. 10 minutes starting now. So that's time up. Now it's time to review your answers, so we'll go over to Mr. Barnes.
Right, let's have a look at this activity based around the internet. It's a fill in the blanks, so you've got the possible answers at the top, you just got to work out where they go. So let's have a go. So we've got the internet is a network of computers, and then we've got the World Wide Web. So web servers on the internet host websites, and each web server has its own unique, well, that's IP, because that's a way of identifying the web server, IP address. When you access a website, you use a URL, okay, and we tend to just call them web address. It's for example, e.g. google.com, okay, but the proper name or acronym is a URL. URLs and their linked IP address, so each URL has a corresponding IP address. So the point of a URL is just to make it easier for us to understand, but it then maps directly to an IP address, which is what can be understood on the network. So URLs and their linked IP addresses are stored on the domain name system. Okay, and they've got domain name system servers. Okay, when you enter a URL into a browser, okay, so you enter google.com into a web browser, for example Google Chrome, Firefox, etc., it sends a URL to the DNS. Okay, so it sends that URL that you've entered to the DNS server, which is effectively a massive table which has the URL and the corresponding IP address, which finds the IP address of the website and sends it back to your computer. Okay, your computer then, once it's got the IP address, can then send a request to the web server by using the IP address for the website, which processes it and sends it back, the website back to your computer. If it can't find the if the DNS can't find the IP address, What it does is it passes the request to a higher DNS. So it will pass it to another DNS server and say, can you find this URL? If the IP address still cannot be found, then an error will be returned. Okay, and say that website cannot be found. So the cloud then. So file storage is available on the internet from many different companies, e.g. Google Drive, Dropbox, etc. The benefits of these services include being able to access your files from any device with an internet connection, as well as freeing up the storage on the device itself. However, drawbacks include the fact that you are unable to access files if you do not have an internet connection, and with it, because it's in the cloud, there are possible security risks as more people can get hold of it. Now, it's worth noting that the cloud, although people normally think of the cloud just as file storage, it is also things like software as a service. So that is things like having access to software like word processing software. Okay, the cloud can offer services, so things like Google Docs, for example. It's a word processing software. It's available through the cloud as software as a service. And there are your answers for the fill in the blanks all about the internet.
Okay, so at the final part of the lesson, it's time for you to complete some exam style questions. Again, you can use your notes for this if you'd like to, and you'll get an opportunity to review your answers afterwards. You're going to get 10 minutes starting now. Fantastic. That's time up. So I'm hoping you had time to complete those. If not, you can pause just to spend a little bit longer if you need to. But otherwise, we'll go over to Mr. Barnes, who will review those answers for us.
Okay, so let's have a look at these exam questions as part of our deliberate practice, all based around DNS, hosting, and the internet. So we've got here the IP address 104.22.71.250 is linked to the website with a URL of www.national.academy. When that URL is entered into a browser, the website homepage is loaded. Describe the relationship between the URL and the IP address and the web server. Now that looks like a really tricky question for 5 marks, and at no point in it does it mention DNS. But actually what it's wanting you to do here is explain the process of what happens from when you enter a URL to it displaying the web page. Okay, which is how does DNS work. So we need 5 marks here. So I'm going to go through the process, and you won't be able to pull out all the points that happen, but you should be able to get 5 marks worth. So I'm going to start with the URL is entered into the web browser. The browser sends the URL to the DNS server. The DNS server looks up the URL to find the corresponding IP address. If it can't find it, it goes to a higher DNS to try and find it. Okay, we're getting there. So then the IP address is sent back to the browser, and the browser sends the request to the IP address. Okay. The web server at the IP address then sends the web page back to the browser. Okay, so there's a lot of steps there. I've probably paraphrased some of them, but I've made sure I've got 5 points in there to get 5 marks. So before we even look at the second question, let's mark this one. Okay, so we need 5 points here. There are more than 5 steps involved in the process of DNS, but let's have a look. Let's move it up. So we could have started by saying that the website is hosted on a web server, but I've not mentioned that in my answer, but you could have. And you could have said the website has an IP address. So I've started with the URL is entered into a web browser. Well, that's not actually in the mark scheme, but it is valid. So I'm not going to give myself a mark for that. But I've then said the browser sends the URL to the DNS. So I've got here the browser sends the URL to the DNS. So that's 1 mark. I've then said the DNS server looks up the URL to find the corresponding IP address. So I've said the DNS finds the IP address, 2 marks. I've then said if it can't find it, it goes to a higher DNS. So that's this bit here. If the DNS can't find the IP, it passes to a higher DNS to try and find it. So that's 3 marks. I've not mentioned that if it's not found, it returns an error, but that is valid. I've then gone on to say the IP address is sent back to the browser. So the IP address is sent back to the browser. That's in the mark scheme, so that's 4 marks. And the browser sends the request to the IP address. So then we've got browser sends the request to the IP address. So I've actually achieved 5 marks. Okay, I've then gone on to say the web server at the IP address sends back the web page back to the browser, which is also in the mark scheme. So you could have said the web server processes the request for the website, and then obviously you say that it sends it back to the user. So you don't have to explain the full process to get the full marks on this question, and that's really important. Okay, but that gives you 5 marks. Okay, so now let's have a look at question 2 then. So we've got here a law firm currently uses a local area network linked to a WAN. They want to upgrade their system to utilize cloud storage. Explain 2 advantages to the law firm of storing their data in the cloud. 4 marks. Okay, so 4 marks, 2 advantages. So it wants you to identify something, and what's really important here, explain 2 advantages to the law firm. You have to apply it to their context, and that makes it a bit trickier. Okay, so I'm going to start with one advantage is that cloud storage can be accessed from anywhere. Now that's going to get me hopefully 1 mark. Okay, now I need to apply the context of the law firm. So I'm going to say, so this means they can take on work from more countries. Okay, so I think that's going to get me 2 marks. The second one then, another advantage is you can have more storage, and this will mean the company can take on more work. Okay, so more storage for 1 mark, applying it to the context for the second mark. Okay, so let's move that up. Let's get the mark scheme at the ready, and let's have a look. So we've got here, so let's go through the first advantage I've got is cloud storage can be accessed from anywhere. So it would allow their employees to work from anywhere. Perfect. So they can take on cases from other countries, so they can take on work from more countries. Okay, so that's 2 marks. Then we've got another advantage, you can have more storage, so it would offer additional storage. So the firm can take on more cases, so the company can take on more work. Okay, what else could we have had? It's very efficient for backing up data, which can save time and money. It is environmentally friendly. It's easy to increase the availability of storage. We've mentioned that one. You do not need specialist network skills, so the firm don't need to employ more staff. It provides third-party security, so you don't need to pay for additional security because it's part of the service. And it provides backup, so you don't need to again have as much backup systems in place because it's done for you. So my answer is 4 marks, but there's a whole host of different answers that you could have had there.
And that's everything you need to know about the internet. Stay tuned for the next episode, and we will see you next time.